In November 2001, a crime unlike anything North Wales had seen before shattered the quiet Isle of Anglesey. Inside her cosy bungalow, 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon was discovered murdered in circumstances so disturbing that even veteran detectives struggled to comprehend what they found. What unfolded next became one of Wales' most unsettling investigations, a bizarre crime scene, an urgent public appeal, and a growing sense of fear within a community that, until then, had always felt safe. As rumours spread and national media descended, two questions dominated every conversation. Who could have done this? And why? In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, I take you through Mabel's story, the police manhunt that followed, the unusual profile of the suspect living just meters away, and the trial that exposed a chilling obsession, along with the legal battles and ongoing questions that continue more than 2 decades later. Now, if you live in the UK, you've probably heard of the Isle of Anglesey. It's an island located off the northwest coast of Wales that's somehow both peaceful and windswept at the same time. It's proper Welsh as well, not just based on the tough-to-pronounce place names, more on that later, but because around 56% of people living there can actually speak Welsh. That's the second highest percentage by area population in Wales. The first is Gwynedd. Tucked away on the island is a village with a name many people know, even if they can't say or spell it. It's that one with 58 letters and 18 syllables. For short, it's known as Llanfairpwll or Llanfairpg, because even the locals don't stand there reciting the full version every time. I'm going to use the latter because it makes it even easier for me. And it may not sound like it, but trust me, I did extensive research into how to pronounce the place names mentioned within this episode correctly. So before you come at me, know that I've done my absolute best, and at the end of the day, I am English. Living in that famous village was 90-year-old Mabel Leyshon. She'd been in the same detached bungalow on Lon Pant for almost 4 decades. She was a real creature of habit. Neighbours said she mostly kept herself to herself, but she certainly wasn't unfriendly. She was just private, and at her age she didn't move about as easily as she used to. But she still valued her independence. Her friends described her as one of those old dears who loved to natter. Ring her up for a quick chat and you'd be there half an hour later unable to get a word in edgewise, or said with a smile of course. Mabel was mentally sharp, chatty, and enjoyed the company. The problem was, she didn't have much of it. She was a widow, and the loneliness got to her from time to time. Her radio became her only companion. Apparently, it was always on, and sometimes, owing to her switching her hearing aids off to save the batteries, it meant the volume would be cranked up enough so half the street knew what she were listening to. Her routine was a simple one, and she stuck to it, which is why what happened in November 2001 stood out immediately as being wrong. At 2:30 on the afternoon of Saturday the 24th, she spoke to a friend on the phone who lived in Birkenhead over in Merseyside. It was just a normal conversation by all accounts. Nothing unusual was discussed, no warning signs displayed, and from that moment until the following lunchtime, nobody truly knows what happened inside that bungalow. Every Sunday, a friend who volunteered for Meals on Wheels would call round with Mabel's Sunday lunch. For anyone unfamiliar, Meals on Wheels is a colloquialism for a service that delivers hot meals to people who can't easily cook for themselves or get out the house. It's been part of life in England and Wales for decades. But for Mabel, it wasn't just about the food. It was the social contact, something she so looked forward to. So, when her friend turned up just after midday on the Sunday and there was no answer at the door, she knew straight away something wasn't right. Mabel was always punctual. If anything, she'd be waiting by the door 5 minutes early. But the blinds were still shut, which was beyond strange for the time of day, and the house looked still. The volunteer called out to her, walking around the property as she did so, trying every way she could to get a response. Then she noticed one of the back windows had been smashed. Glass was everywhere. It looked like something had been thrown through it. With that, the alarm was raised, and officers from North Wales Police were there soon after. What they found inside that bungalow was horrifying. Mabel was in her sitting room, her body slumped in a chair. She'd been attacked in an extremely violent way, which the police described as being callous and brutal. Dr. Brian Rogers, the Home Office pathologist who carried out the post-mortem, later said he believed she'd been stabbed 22 times in total. With the attack coming from behind and 90-year-old Mabel only being 4'11", she had zero chance of defending herself. It appeared she'd been sitting in her favourite armchair, her back to the living room door, with the TV turned up loud because of her hearing. The attack happened in that very chair, but afterwards she'd been moved to another, the one in which she was found, and whoever did this abhorrent crime didn't stop there. 2 candlesticks had been placed near her body. 2 fireside pokers were laid out on the floor in an X shape at her feet. Those were deliberate acts by someone who appeared to be thinking clearly. Whoever did this was methodical and took their time. And then there was the most disturbing part of the scene. Mabel's killer had cut out her heart. It had been wrapped in newspaper and placed in a saucepan, which sat on top of a silver platter in the same room. To top things off, there were 3 cuts on her leg, and some of her blood had been collected in that same saucepan. Detectives later said they believed the killer had consumed some of that blood. This wasn't just murder, it was ritualistic. It's a concept which is hard to grasp even before you add in the fact that this all happened in the home of a quiet, gentle, lonely 90-year-old woman who wouldn't dream of hurting anyone. To spend 9 decades living on this earth and then have it ended in such a brutal fashion is beyond heartbreaking. The investigation that followed was massive for a village the size of Llanfair PG. Police basically asked everyone who'd been in the area that weekend to retrace their steps. Anyone who'd driven down Long Pont, walked past Mabel's house, gone to the shop, taken the dog out, anything, it didn't matter. Detectives wanted to talk to them. Officers were out speaking to pedestrians, pulling over motorists, trying to build a picture of what happened between Saturday afternoon and Sunday lunchtime. This was one of those cases where the usual motive didn't quite fit, so they needed every tiny clue they could get. By Thursday, November 29th, North Wales Police announced they'd be checking CCTV from the Britannia Bridge, one of the 2 that linked Anglesey to the mainland. The Menai Strait, a narrow, fast-moving stretch of tidal water, sits underneath it. There was also something else that had caught their attention. In the days leading up to Mabel's murder, several people reported seeing a light-coloured van, blue was the colour most people claimed, parked in her driveway. That immediately raised eyebrows, because Mabel never mentioned having any tradespeople booked. She lived a pretty quiet life, so a random van suddenly appearing outside her home wasn't exactly normal. Witnesses described seeing 2 men with the van on different occasions. One was tall with dark hair and a fringe. The other was shorter, stockier, and had a crew cut. Then, on the day she was killed, another blue van, or possibly the same one, was seen near her bungalow. Might have been coincidence, might not, but the police needed to know for sure. Yet, despite repeated appeals, nobody owning that van came forward. Even if the driver had nothing to do with Mabel's murder, detectives still needed to eliminate him. North Wales Police decided to bring in outside help too, the National Crime Faculty, a criminal psychologist, the works. They wanted to build a profile of who could have done something this bizarre and violent. And while this was happening, officers were still searching for the murder weapon, which was thought to be some type of bladed instrument. They also released details of a door-to-door salesman who'd been knocking around the village on the Friday. Now again, he could have been innocent, but in an investigation such as this, nobody gets a free pass. That winter was a particularly tough one for the area. On December 4th, a man's body was found on the banks of the Menai Strait below the Britannia Bridge. The post-mortem showed he was a 37-year-old man named David Glyn Griffiths. It looked like he'd set himself on fire before jumping from the bridge, and he died from smoke inhalation and multiple injuries. A passerby had spotted him near the shoreline. And on the same day, a second body was found at Aberfrau on the west side of the island. That one wasn't linked to anything, according to early checks. Imagine being the police that week. 3 deaths, all within miles of each other. Officers said there was no evidence connecting the bridge incident to Mabel's murder, but because David lived in Gaowen, a village that's basically down the road, they had to check. They looked into his movements, spoke to friends and family, and eventually ruled him out completely. Wrong place, wrong time, nothing more. By the end of the first week of December though, new witnesses started coming forward. People said they'd seen someone hanging around Mabel's house at around 3 p.m. on the Saturday, the day she last spoke to a friend. One woman said the man stood there for up to 10 minutes, and it made her uncomfortable enough that she stayed on the opposite side of the road. She went with a gut feeling on that occasion. Descriptions provided by witnesses varied wildly, as they so often do. One witness described a man around 5'8", mid-20s to mid-30s, unshaven, straight dark hair, rucksack, jeans, and a blue and red jacket. Another describes someone completely different. 6'6", about 40, well-built, scruffy appearance, but also carrying a rucksack. And this is the thing about eyewitness accounts. They can be incredibly unreliable. People remember different things or fill in the blanks without meaning to. Some focus on clothing, others on height, and some just guess because the situation felt odd. Police do take witness accounts seriously, but they're never treated as gospel. Detectives were also considering something pretty drastic: mass DNA testing of the village. It wasn't a decision they'd come to lightly, but they had a reason for it. The Forensic Science Service team from Chorley in Lancashire had been at Mabel's bungalow from the start. They went through the crime scene inch by inch, collecting samples, logging everything. They discovered that a slate from outside the house had been yanked loose and thrown through the kitchen window. That's how Mabel's killer had gained access, and it explained the smashed glass the volunteer at Meals on Wheels saw. The forensic team also checked the windowsill and found blood. Most of it belonged to Mabel, but in the background was a faint trace of another person, a male. That was the first hint the killer might have injured himself while breaking in, and until they could match that trace, they couldn't rule anyone out. They also found shoe prints, clear impressions. That became their first solid piece of physical evidence. With all these revelations, burglary was quickly ruled out as a motive. Nothing of value were taken, and the scene inside showed intention, not an opportunistic burglar who'd panicked. By December 10th, police announced that a man had come forward after seeing himself mentioned in the media appeals. He admitted he'd been outside Mabel's house on the Saturday afternoon, right around the time one of the witnesses reported, but he said he was just waiting for a lift to work. After being questioned, officers eliminated him from the inquiry. It felt like the investigation was constantly moving but never landing anywhere solid. Leads appeared, then fizzled out just as quickly. Witnesses remembered things that didn't match, and all the while they still didn't know who'd gone into that bungalow on Lon Pant and carried out one of the strangest, most disturbing crimes North Wales had ever seen. By this point, more than 60 officers were working the case, and with Christmas around the corner, North Wales Police decided to put Mabel's murder front and centre on the December 20th episode of Crime Watch. Her story opened the show. Fiona Bruce introduced the appeal, and even she said that in all her time hosting Crime Watch, this was one of the worst cases she'd ever come across. Detective Superintendent Alan Jones, who was leading the inquiry, echoed that sentiment. In his 25 years on the job, he'd never seen anything like what had happened inside Mabel's bungalow. Coming from a senior officer who'd no doubt seen his fair share of horrific crime scenes, that really said something. The appeal went back over everything the public already knew: the timing, the nature of the attack, the strange staging of items inside the house, and the continued search for the mystery blue van and its 2 drivers. Yet despite the weeks that had passed and all the appeals, nobody had come forward to claim it were them, and police still believe that van, and whoever was inside it, could be key. DS Jones also spoke about the type of person they believe might be responsible. He thought the killer was most likely local, someone who lived either on Anglesey or very near it. He believed this was a man dealing with severe mental health issues, but who may never have been on the radar of doctors or mental health services. Someone withdrawn, isolated, maybe socially awkward, could be living alone or still at home with elderly parents, and crucially, someone who almost certainly knew who Mabel was. Not well enough to be friends necessarily, but well enough to know she lived alone. There was plenty of talk in the press about whether the killing was ritualistic, especially with the strange placement of the pokers and the other details inside the house. But DS Jones shut that down on Crime Watch. Police had consulted experts in the occult and witchcraft circles, and there was nothing to suggest the killer was following any kind of ritual. Whatever motivated him, it wasn't that. What they were confident about, though, was that whoever did this would have been absolutely covered in blood. There was no clean way out of that bungalow. DS Jones appealed directly to anyone who might have seen someone that weekend wearing stained clothing, acting on edge or odd, or disappearing suddenly without explanation. Another officer, DS Keith Jones, also delivered part of that appeal in Welsh. Llanfair PG and the surrounding communities have plenty of Welsh-only speakers, and even among bilingual people, many just feel more comfortable talking in their native language. The police didn't want anyone hesitating because of that. As is usually the case, the response on the back of that Crime Watch episode was immediate. More than 100 calls came in after it aired, and several of them were described as being very promising. There were even 3 separate offers of reward money from members of the public. People just wanted to help get this solved. For the first time since the murder, detectives felt they might finally be edging towards something solid. As it headed towards the back end of December, the investigation was still grinding on, and more than 100 people had already handed over DNA samples. Detectives were debating whether to widen that net even further, maybe go for a full screening of the whole village, but no firm decision had been made yet. Detective Superintendent Alan Jones kept making the same appeal. If anyone knew something, even if it felt insignificant, now was the time to speak up. That included people working in social services, the NHS, probation, anyone who might have had contact with someone acting strangely, or who suddenly set off alarm bells in the mind. At the same time, North Wales police were talking to detectives down in Suffolk, where another elderly woman, 79-year-old Joan Albert, had been found stabbed to death in her home just a few days before Christmas. On the surface, the 2 cases looked similar, but there was nothing concrete linking them. And, as we now know, Joan's killer would turn out to be someone completely different. Simon Hall. Now that's a strange case in itself, and maybe one worth covering in a future episode. Back on Anglesey, the community was on edge. In early January 2002, UK-based charity Age Concern, which I think is now Age UK, issued a public appeal asking people to keep an eye on their older neighbours. With a murder like this, especially one involving someone as vulnerable as Mabel, a lot of elderly residents were feeling nervous. The charity wanted people to check in, to make sure nobody was worrying alone behind closed doors. A CCTV camera funded by the police and the Home Office was installed directly opposite Mabel's bungalow to help reassure residents, and more cameras were planned for other parts of the island. But to some, it was too little, too late. Police also parked a mobile station in Llanfair PG and increased their foot patrols. It didn't solve anything, but it made the village residents feel a bit less forgotten while officers kept digging away behind the scenes. And eventually, all that digging paid off. Detectives decided to refocus their efforts around Mabel's home. They started interviewing every male living within that immediate area. And on Saturday, January 5th, 2002, they knocked on the door of a nearby house where a 17-year-old art student lived. His name was Matthew Hardman, though that wasn't made public at the time because of his age. Hardman had already given a statement earlier in the inquiry, but when the detectives started asking him to go back over certain points, things didn't line up. His story kept shifting. While they were there, the officers also noticed a pair of his Levi trainers that looked awfully similar to the footprints found inside Mabel's bungalow. They took them away for analysis. The trainers had a distinctive make and pattern, and when forensic experts examined them, they matched them to the prints at the scene. At first, it was described as a moderately strong match, about 1 in 1,000, but once more advanced techniques were used, that probability shifted dramatically. In court, it would later be quoted as a 1 in 73 million chance of being wrong. Then there was the kitchen knife they found in the pocket of Hardman's coat. Forensics tested it and discovered tiny traces of Mabel's DNA from blood inside the handle. On its own, that would have been worrying enough, but detectives also found a stash of vampire-themed books, magazines, and online research in his room, material they obviously wanted to scrutinize further given the way Mabel had been found. So, on the morning of Tuesday, January 8th, officers returned to the house just before 8 a.m. and arrested Hardman. Then began 3 days of intense questioning at Carnarvon Police Station. After the first 24 hours were up, a superintendent authorised an extra 12 hours, and then Holyhead Youth Corps allowed an additional 24. By 6:12 p.m. on January 10th, everything had changed. Forensic scientists at the Chorley lab phoned to confirm a full DNA match. Minutes later, DS Alan Jones stepped out and announced to the press that Hardman had officially been charged with Mabel's murder. The next day, he appeared at Holyhead Magistrates Court, where a crowd of locals had gathered outside, shouting abuse as he was brought in handcuffed with a grey blanket over his head. Inside the courtroom, the hearing was brief, and his solicitor made it clear his client would be denying everything. The trial began at Mould Crown Court in July 2002, where Hardman continued to deny ever having set foot inside Mabel's home. During proceedings, the court heard that he had been living just a few yards away from her, sharing a bungalow with his mum, a nurse who, like Mabel, was a widow, and her partner. At one time, Hardman had even been Mabel's paperboy. Born and raised in Amlwch on the north coast of Anglesey, he'd moved to Llanfair PG in 1998 at the age of 13, the same year his father died from a severe asthma attack. Although his parents had lived separately, Hardman had remained close to his father and was said to have been deeply upset by the loss. One of the most striking pieces of testimony came from a German exchange student who described how Hardman had begged her to turn him into a vampire. She said they had spent around 2 hours talking before he suddenly accused her of being a vampire and demanded she bite him. When she refused, he allegedly became violent and had to be removed by a friend and the landlady, who eventually called the police. That was after Hardman had punched himself in the nose and urged them all to smell his blood. Sergeant Peter Nicholson, who responded to the call in the early hours of September 23, 2001, told the court that Hardman was incoherent and said one thing repeatedly: "Bite my neck." Hardman was arrested for breach of the peace but wasn't charged with anything. That incident occurred just 2 months before Mabel was killed. The court also heard from Home Office pathologist Dr. Rogers, who initially believed the injuries on Mabel's body were an attempt at dismemberment, but later concluded they were consistent with an attempt to drain blood. Prosecutors claimed Hardman was obsessed with vampires and killed Mabel in a misguided bid for immortality. They said he attacked her while his mother and her partner were away for the weekend. But Hardman rejected this, telling the jury he only had a subtle interest in vampires. He dismissed them as science fiction and insisted he never believed they were real. He also said he had no memory of the incident with the German student, claiming he had gone to her room to discuss psychology and had smoked cannabis before waking up in a police station with no recollection of officers entering the property. Prosecutor Roger Thomas KC described a later conversation Hardman had had with the exchange student, during which Hardman was said to have wondered whether someone bitten by a vampire who then killed an elderly person could themselves transform. I struggle to wrap my head around that bit, but regardless, Hardman denied ever making such comments or expressing any desire to harm older people. After a 2-week trial, the jury reached a unanimous guilty verdict in August 2002, taking almost 4 hours to agree on their decision. The evidence presented had been so disturbing that many journalists covering the trial reported struggling to write about it. Hardman reportedly wept as Mr. Justice Richard sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. The judge said, "You hoped for immortality, but all you have achieved is the brutal ending of another person's life and the bringing of a life sentence upon yourself." Once sentencing was complete, the judge lifted the reporting restriction on Hardman's name and he was transferred to HMP Alt Course in Liverpool to start serving his sentence. Despite the unanimous verdict, Hardman's solicitor, Michael Strain, continued to insist that the real killer might still be at large. Speaking after the trial, he said that both Hardman and his family were deeply disappointed by the outcome and that he had already spent several weeks exploring grounds for an appeal. Papers were lodged with the Court of Appeal, and Strain expressed hope that a hearing might be held before Christmas 2002. However, in January 2003, the first appeal was swiftly rejected by an appeal court judge. Determined to press on, Strain vowed to continue fighting to prove Hardman's innocence, and even represented him for free after legal aid was refused. A second appeal followed later that year, but was also dismissed. In October 2003, 3 senior judges, Lord Justice Mantell, Mr. Justice Butterfield, and Mrs. Justice Cox, rejected the defence's argument that the trial judge had wrongly allowed what they described as potentially devastating evidence to be placed before the jury. Hardman therefore remained in custody, and an application for parole in 2014 was similarly turned down. Then, more than 2 decades after the murder, the case resurfaced. In August 2023, it was revealed that Hardman's conviction was being reviewed by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, CCRC. That's the independent body responsible for investigating potential miscarriages of justice. A spokesperson confirmed only that an application had been received and that a review was underway, adding that it would be inappropriate to comment further while the process continued. They were also unable to give any indication of how long the review might take, and since that announcement, no further update has been made public as far as I can tell, leaving it unclear whether the review remains ongoing or has already concluded, and if so, what the outcome may have been. Mabel Leyshon's story is a reminder of how profoundly communities feel the loss of someone who asked for very little and deserves so much more than the violence she was subjected to. In the wake of her death, neighbours, friends, and even complete strangers were shaken, not only by the brutality of what happened, but by the vulnerability it exposed. Cases like Mabel's stay with us because they disturb something fundamental, the belief that home is a refuge. And although her killer was convicted and justice in the formal sense was seen to be done, the lingering questions, appeals, and later reviews show how crime doesn't always end at the courtroom door. At its heart, this is a story about a woman who should have been safe, loved, and left to enjoy her final years in peace, and about the collective responsibility we all share to look out for those who may not have the strength to look out for themselves. Thanks for listening to British Murders with Stuart Blues. Please consider giving British Murders a follow on your podcast player of choice or subscribing on YouTube. It really does help. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.